Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Open Census webinar. We will be discussing how you can understand whether or not you need more or less office space in your corporate spaces. My name is David Thomas, and I'm going to be hosting today's session. And in today's topic, we're going to be looking at some of the changes that teams can make to their real estate strategy, both to make their workplace more efficient and also to maximize their ROI on real estate spend. In looking at this, we're going to look at which metrics and data points are kind of central to these decisions, both in the long and short term. And then finally, we're going to look at the actual ways that data can be gathered and the way that we can present this data to make it understandable and very useful in making decisions. Before we dive into the session itself, I'd like to bring the chat function to your attention. So if you do have any questions at any time, please do just jot it in there and I'll try and get to them as I can. So first things first, I want to briefly touch on some important aspects of actually conducting workplace change and real estate change. And a couple of years back, we spoke with Louis Lurst of Veldhoen & Co., who was very pivotal in the activity-based working movement a couple of decades back now. And he always stresses the importance of maintaining guiding principles when you're undergoing these kind of projects, which you should refer back to every time you're considering a change and try to answer or ask yourself, in what way does this change help address the problem that we're facing? So when we're talking about real estate strategy and adjustment, you want to be asking questions such as, what is the purpose of this office? What is the scale of change that we need? What's the function of it? Who do we need to be there and when? And make sure that when you're then considering the changes to the scale of your real estate, that you're always kind of readdressing these problems. And the easiest way to kind of get started with these is to immediately define what your challenges are. And this can be quite simple from the very get-go, really, because you kind of know from just walking around the office whether or not it's very full or whether or not it's very empty. So there's a few kind of key statements that'll change from office to office. But it's things like, just if these statements ring true or false, you kind of then know where you need to start and potentially what your guiding principle should be. So if the statements are office is empty for most of the week applies to you, then you might be needing to think about downsizing or potentially leasing smaller spaces throughout the city instead of one big office. And on the opposite side, if employees regularly struggle to find space is something that you can relate to, then it might be time to start looking to expand your floors or lease some extra space for people to overflow into. But kind of asking yourselves these very simple questions at the start of the process is one of the best ways to make sure that the changes that you make are actually solving the problems that you're facing and not just kind of making change for change's sake, which in the current real estate market is, well, kind of pointless and also very risk heavy in terms of spend. So that's how we would recommend getting started. And then to look at some kind of, these are the kind of metrics that we want to talk about or consider when we're looking at real estate strategy. So how many people are coming in a day? What percentage of your desks are in use? What's your person to desk ratio? And whether or not your meeting rooms are being well used. Because these are the kind of the main functions of an office, I guess. And it's when these are either being too stressed or there's far too much of it available, so there's an abundance of space, that's when you know that you need to start making changes. And these are what you want to look at for kind of long-term leasing arrangements. But then if you want to go short-term and you think that if you're locked into a lease, but you think you might be able to release a floor, for example, that's when you can start looking at more short-term metrics, so like monthly or weekly trends in occupancy, seeing what's happening between Monday and Friday. Do you have a busy midweek period and then drop off on Mondays and Fridays? And do you kind of see that it's going up over time or dropping? And you can also then start to look at floor by floor occupancy and how each department's behaving as well. And we'll get onto how to do that in more detail shortly. But before we do that, it's probably important to mention how this data is actually gathered, or at least how we gather this data. And we do that by creating sensor networks through our office spaces, which go from a variety of different types of sensors through to our own proprietary gateways. And then these gateways transfer the data into the cloud where it's processed by our analytics software and presented in just the dashboard, where there's a load of key metrics and ways of analysing and splicing the data to solve your problems. And the sensors that we're going to be talking about today, when it comes to real estate and occupancy, are desk PIRs, footfall counters, and room counters. So desk PIRs are when you're trying to look quite granularly at how each department's working or how many desks are free per floor. And these monitor body heat and motion, and they stick just on the underside of your desk, facing outwards, and they can tell you how often throughout the day that space is used. So typically you'd use these on any individual workstation, so be it an actual desk or in a phone booth or just a kind of private working space. They're very versatile and very easy to use, and well, they're battery powered as well, so they can be moved around very easily. The next one we're going to look at is room counters. These are what tell you how many people are in a room at once. So they sit in the ceiling and kind of divide the room into a grid, and they tell you how many areas of that grid are in use at any one time. And the point of doing that is to see not only is that room kind of in demand, like is it actually being used, but is it being used efficiently? Because if you've got a series of 12 to 20 person rooms which are being used by 3 to 4 people, then you are, while those meeting rooms are being used, you're not using space efficiently, and you could probably be downsizing to something more suitable to your needs. And the final type of sensor we're going to look at and discuss today is the footfall counter. And these typically sit above doorways or entrances and exits, and they count how many people go in and out, and then you can kind of get a very macro high-level view of how your spaces are being used. And each of these sensors is very valuable in these kind of decisions. But going back to your guiding principles, it's more a case of what do you actually want to know. Do you really want to know exactly how many desks you need per floor, or what kind of desk capacity you need, or do you just want to know roughly how many people are on the floor at any one time and what kind of space fits that? And it's those kind of considerations that will then later dictate which sensor you deploy throughout your offices. So now that we've got the, I guess, technical part of it going, it's time to talk about how we then start to understand this data. And key to this is what we call sensor tagging. So the sensors obviously are attached to assets and placed throughout the office, but it's not just a case of this sensor is triggered. You then get to define what that sensor is. So if you have a sit-stand desk in the northwest corner of your building on the 4th floor in the I was about to say humanities department, as if I'm still at uni, but if you have it in the marketing department and it's facing east and it's a bookable desk, those are all individual ways that you can tag that sensor, and then you can look to see how it compares those tags compared to other sensors, other sensor tags, and see which ones are most popular. Are people typically using the sit-stand desks more? Do the bookable desks get used more, and is it worth expanding the booking system? That kind of decision can really actually help inform what spaces are necessary and how many of them. And the exact same thing can be done with your rooms, so you can see which capacity rooms are being used most. Can you afford to get rid of a certain type of room if you moved office and just have the smaller ones or the larger ones? The more time you spend early on making these kind of assessments, the more valuable and usable the data will really be to make quite in detail decisions, I should say. You'll be able to dive down into it more and start to see the nuances of what's actually going on in your office space. So the footfall sensors that we talked about earlier, the way that the data from these is presented is kind of on a floor by floor basis. So you can do it on a building basis as well. You can have them on the very front door of your building, and in tandem with your, and it'll be in tandem with your badge data if you have that, but more accurate, because one of the largest problems with badge data, and I'm pretty certain anyone here who's kind of dealt with badge data or tried to do with badge data, is that a lot of the time you don't need to swipe to come out. So if someone goes out for lunch and comes back in, there'll be clocks going in twice, but out naught. And also people kind of following behind other people. And once you're in the building as well, you rarely have to swipe to get anywhere else. So having these footfall counters on the entrances to a building will give you a very accurate count of who's coming into the building throughout the day and how many people and when. When are the spikes? When are the troughs? And then you can go even more granular and put them on the floors. So whether that's on the entrances or exits or over the elevators, it's kind of up to you. And on it changes on a case-by-case level. But then you can see which of the floors are busiest, which floors are emptiest, and potentially see, if you know the maximum capacity of the floors, can we then afford to kind of condense downwards? Are these floors being used to their full capacity or not? And this is a quite good way to start one of these processes, I would say, because it's relatively few sensors, it's quite light to touch, and then you can see how severe your problem is or how severe your problem isn't, what might be the case. But yeah, it's a good way to set a baseline and get a very solid start and view to what you might be able to do. And then to progress to a more granular level is when you start looking at seats and the PIR sensors themselves. So when you log into our dashboard, on the seats and rooms overview, you get some very just high level key metrics. So underused desks and underused rooms. So if they use less than 15% of the day, and that's kind of just telling you on a building level, how many of your desks aren't being used. So realistically, what could you potentially afford to get rid of? And then this is presented in tandem with average utilization, peak, and peak utilization. The problem with this, though, is that it doesn't really tell you what that new space needs to look like. It just tells you whether or not you need more space or less space. And in this case, well, this data is quite old, to be fair. So this is from just coming back from COVID. So they were starting to ramp up again. But clearly, they have quite a few underused seats. So they're not in any rush to rent any more space, but similarly, they probably wouldn't be thinking about downsizing yet. But if you did want to then get more granular, you can then break those metrics down by floor, because each sensor that was feeding into those overviews will then be tagged by a floor and by department, and you can start breaking it down into separate chunks or separate ways of looking at it. So you can then see here all the desks on the 5th floor, 4th floor, etc. How many of them are in use throughout the day, how many are underused, and also how that is changing over time. So here, if you look at the time bar in the top right-hand corner, we are looking at a 3-month period. So the first number on the left in the peak utilization column is 66% for 5th floor south. That's looking at what happened in that 3-month period. And then the number next to it is saying how that compares to the 3 months beforehand. So you can see whether or not your occupancy is going up or down in an overall trend and how that's going floor by floor. Next up, another way of doing it, if you want to get really specific, is to look at how your departments are using their space. So in the exact same way, you can see which departments are using their space efficiently, which ones aren't, and which ones are growing and which ones are shrinking. And this way you can start to make judgments on, right, if we take these seats away from this group and give them to this one, we don't actually need to get more space because the space exists, it's just not being used efficiently by the people that currently have it. And one of the most common complaints we have when people come to us with problems is that they know that there's space available, but department heads or department managers are quite loath to give it up. And without this evidence, there's not really much you can do about it. But if you can then build a business case based on actual data on how their teams are behaving, then it's a lot easier to have a productive conversation regarding the space that they actually require. So that's looking at desks. And now we want to move quickly onto meeting rooms. And what you can see in front of you is the Open Sensors like suggestions calculator or right sizing calculator. So what this is doing is looking at how every meeting room you have throughout a space is being used and how many people are in those rooms, and then calculating what a more suitable array would have been. So here, where you can see they have 0 rooms for 2 people and 10 rooms for 2, and it suggests 10 rooms for 2 people. That immediately suggests that some of these larger rooms are not being used effectively. They are probably having people doing their little one-to-ones in them. So they're in use, there is a need for the space, but the right spaces are currently not available. And the way that this calculator works is by using those counter sensors that we spoke about earlier. And the way that the data from these is presented is as such. So if you were using just a presence detector to say how often that room is in use, what you'd see is in this top graph. So how that room was in use over time. And clearly it's in use a fair amount. 5.5 hours a day is a pretty well used room. But then if you look at the graph beneath it, that's what's coming from the counting data. So say where the peak occupancy is still 6, it was in use, it was full a couple of times. On average, it was only at 3 people. So you'd be better off splitting that room into either 2 3-people rooms or a 4-person and a 2-person, and making sure that more people could use that space in a more efficient manner. And when you start to look at that, you can then say, right, we potentially don't actually need to move to a bigger space with more meeting rooms. We can just look at the meeting spaces we've got, readjust them so that more people can use them at the same time, and increase efficiency that way without having to increase spend on releasing a new floor purely for meeting rooms. And finally, the asset management and asset planning is a very important part similarly. So if you have a series of departments or floors with desks, and they're all one-to-one seating, and some of your departments are busy and some of them are full, and then other ones are very empty, the way to actually kind of avoid having to expand is to introduce desk sharing amongst the busy people and taking spaces away from those who don't require them. And generating mobility profiles, such as the ones that you can see on the screen in front of you, are a really helpful way of doing that, because you can see which spaces are being badly used, which ones are fixed and need to be kept that way. And then you can do this by asset as well, so you can see how many of those stand desks need to be fixed, how many of them need to be bookable, how many of them can be shared between how many people. And breaking your spaces down in this way makes it far easier to correct or make incremental changes to the spaces that you have to better utilize them without expanding. But then sometimes there will come a point where utilization is too high, and this data will be able to verify that, and you can say, right, this is when we need to get more space. Or if you do everything right and you introduce better desk ratios, you might then be able to actually release some space if you can then kind of get more people using a smaller space more efficiently. So we've overrun a little bit from the 15 minutes, but if you have any questions, please do feel free to drop me an email at david.a@opencentres.com or visit our website to have a look around, and there's always get in touch forms on there, and you can book demos that way as well if you'd like to see more of how the dashboard works and how our solution kind of operates from an end-to-end perspective. Thank you all for your time this afternoon, and I hope you have great days. Cheers. Bye.